I'm Rick Stanford. I'm 70 years old and honestly, I'm still trying to process the betrayal I've faced from my own flesh and blood. As a self-made industrial refrigeration tycoon from Dallas, Texas, I always thought the empire I built would serve as a permanent safety net for my family. But last Christmas, I learned a hard, painful lesson. Wealth without boundaries only feeds a toxic sense of entitlement. My son sent me a text telling me to spend the holidays alone because they needed space as a family. Shortly after, his wife accidentally forwarded a message meant for her inner circle to our family group chat. She was bragging about finally kicking the old man to the curb, adding that maybe someday I'd earned the right to sit at the table with them. I just sat there, reading the screen, then put down the antique train set I'd bought for my grandson. I replied, "Thanks for letting me know. I'm canceling all payments today." Before I go on, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever had to cut ties with toxic family to protect your own peace, please hit that like button and subscribe. It was exactly 3:00 p.m. on December 23rd when the illusion of my perfect family shattered. I was standing in a high-end vintage toy boutique in Highland Park Village. The store smelled like expensive pine candles and polished wood. It was bustling with wealthy grandparents picking up last-minute gifts, faces beaming with holiday cheer. In my hand, I held a handmade brass locomotive. It was heavy, built to last, the kind of toy meant to be passed down through generations. I had planned to give it to my grandson. Since my beautiful wife, Beverly, passed away 3 years ago from a sudden illness, my son Bradley and his family were all I had left in the world. Or so I foolishly thought. I had willingly moved out of our massive family estate and into a modest, quiet apartment downtown, simply because Bradley and his wife, Tiffany, claimed they needed a proper house to raise the kids. I gave them everything, hoping to buy back that warmth and closeness Beverly used to bring into our lives. I stood at the register, watching the clerk wrap the locomotive in festive red paper when my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I pulled it out, expecting a message about what time to come over for our traditional Christmas Eve dinner. Instead, it was a text from Bradley. I adjusted my glasses and stared at the glowing screen. The message was short, cold, and completely unexpected. "Dad, spend Christmas on your own this year. We need some space as a family." For a split second, I stopped breathing. The background noise of the toy shop faded into a dull ringing in my ears. Spending Christmas alone. I'm a 70-year-old widower. We hadn't spent a single Christmas apart since Bradley was born 35 years ago. I read the text over and over, desperate to find some hidden context or a reasonable explanation. Maybe someone was sick. Maybe Tiffany was just under a lot of stress. I was ready to make excuses for him, ready to be the considerate father who takes the hit just to keep the peace. I started typing a reply, asking if everything was all right. But before my thumb hit send, the phone buzzed again. It was a message from Tiffany. As I scanned the text, my blood ran cold. It was clear she'd meant to send this to her private group of socialite friends, but in her rush, she dropped it right into our shared family chat. "Finally got rid of the old man," it read. God, I couldn't stand listening to another holiday story about his boring manufacturing days. Maybe one day he'll earn the right to sit with us, but for now, the mansion is all ours. I froze. The clerk behind the counter asked if I was paying with cash or card, but her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. I stared at the words glowing on my screen. Got rid of the old man. Earned the right to sit with us. A deep, suffocating silence washed over me, followed by a sudden, sharp clarity. Earned the right. The phrase echoed in my mind, rattling against my skull until it hardened into a cold, focused anger. I didn't spend 40 years building a business empire from a rusty toolbox just to be treated like a stray dog begging for scraps. I looked at the brass train being wrapped on the counter. Then, I thought about the house they were sitting in. A massive six-bedroom estate in Highland Park, complete with a temperature-controlled infinity pool and imported Italian marble floors. I had paid $2.2 million in pure cash for that house. I thought about the country club memberships they bragged about on social media, fully covered by the trust account I'd set up. I thought about Tiffany's endless designer bags, her luxury spa days, and her lavish brunches. I thought about the American Express Platinum card in her wallet, tied directly to my personal bank account, where I silently paid off $10,000 bills every single month, just so she could play the part of a high society socialite. They were living a millionaire lifestyle, completely subsidized by the sweat, the grease, and the countless sleepless nights of the old man they so clearly despised. Beverly had warned me. In her final months, my brilliant, sharp-witted wife had held my hand and told me that cushioning every fall for Bradley would only turn him into a weak, entitled man. She warned me that Tiffany was consumed by an insatiable hunger for status that no amount of money could ever satisfy. Blinded by fatherly love, I'd ignored her. But standing there in that crowded toy store, reading those texts, the blindfold was ripped off for good. There was no sadness left in me, no urge to call and demand an explanation, no desire to scream, cry, or beg for a seat at a table I had bought with my own hard-earned money. When you survive 4 decades in the ruthless world of industrial business, you learn one thing: anger is a useless emotion. Action is the only thing that matters. I looked up at the clerk who was staring at me with polite concern. "I'm so sorry," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I won't be needing the train today. Please cancel the transaction." I walked out of the boutique and into the crisp, biting Texas air. I stood on the sidewalk, watching the luxury cars drive by, and felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. The heavy burden of trying to buy my family's affection had just been lifted off my shoulders. I unlocked my phone, opened the family group chat, and typed my reply. No all caps, no exclamation points. I kept it as cold and precise as a corporate termination notice. "Thanks for letting me know. I'm canceling all payments today. Merry Christmas." I hit send. Then, without a second's hesitation, I opened my banking app. With a calm that almost scared me, I navigated to the credit card management portal. I selected the Amex Platinum card assigned to Tiffany. With a single tap, I froze the account. I moved to the automatic payment section of my checking account. I found the monthly transfers for the Highland Park property taxes, the hefty homeowner's insurance, and the luxury landscaping services. Cancel, cancel, cancel. I slipped my phone back into my coat pocket, buttoned it against the wind, and headed to my car. The war had begun in silence. If my son and his wife thought I was just an ignorant old man waiting to be pushed aside, they were about to get the most brutal lesson of their lives. The drive from Highland Park Village back to my apartment takes exactly 23 minutes. All the way, my hands gripped the leather steering wheel with steady, quiet resolve. I drove past the massive estates wrapped in exquisite Christmas lights, past the manicured lawns and towering oak trees. This was the neighborhood I'd moved my son into, the neighborhood I'd spent a fortune to secure for a family that clearly didn't need me anymore. I pulled into the cold, underground parking garage of my modest apartment complex. After Beverly died, the silence in that massive family home had become too heavy for me to bear alone. I'd given it to Bradley and Tiffany, thinking a young family would breathe new life into those walls. I had taken a simple 2-bedroom for myself, thinking I was doing something noble, something a loving father would do. Now, walking into my quiet apartment, the harsh reality of that decision hit me. I had sacrificed my final years to build them a kingdom, and they had locked me out of the castle. I took off my heavy winter coat, draped it over the chair, and walked straight to my desk. I didn't bother turning on the overhead lights. The cold afternoon sun filtering through the blinds was enough. I sat in the leather office chair, the same chair I'd sat in while negotiating million-dollar industrial refrigeration contracts. I pulled out my phone and opened my secure banking app. My heart rate was perfectly normal, no hesitation. First, the credit card portal. The Amex Platinum stared back at me. I clicked the Authorized User tab. Tiffany Stanford. Her name was attached to a card that had already racked up over $9,000 in charges this month alone. Designer shoes, organic groceries, high-end spa treatments, and thousands spent at a luxury boutique hotel just last weekend. I tapped the screen. A prompt asked if I was absolutely sure I wanted to freeze the card. I clicked yes. The card became dead weight in an instant. Next, I moved to the AutoPay tab. Every month, thousands of dollars flowed out of my account to cover the operating costs of the Highland Park mansion. They called it their house, but the deed was entirely in my name. I scrolled down to the property tax escrow payment. It was a massive monthly expense that allowed them to live completely debt-free. I clicked cancel. Then, the expensive home insurance policy. Cancel. I found the monthly prepayment for the luxury landscaping services, the people who kept Tiffany's exotic rose bushes pruned to perfection and the sprawling lawn looking like a professional golf course. Cancel. Finally, I found the pool maintenance and the expensive smart home security subscription. Cancel. Cancel. In less than 3 minutes, I had completely dismantled the massive financial scaffolding supporting their highly artificial life. I closed the banking app, placed my phone face down on the polished wood desk, and let out a long, slow breath. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of clarity. For 3 years, I had been an open vault, bleeding money to keep up the illusion of their success. I had convinced myself this was what a good, supportive father was supposed to do. But a good father shouldn't fund someone's disrespect toward him. A good father shouldn't pay to be treated like an expendable burden. I stood up, walked to my small kitchen, and expertly brewed a cup of black coffee. The motions felt familiar and comforting. I carefully measured the grounds, poured the hot water, and listened to the slow, steady drip. The silence in my apartment no longer felt lonely. It felt peaceful. It felt like I had finally reclaimed my own territory. I walked back into the living room with my steaming mug and sank into my armchair. I watched the grandfather clock ticking quietly in the corner. I knew Tiffany's shopping habits on the day before Christmas Eve too well. She was definitely out there, darting between luxury department stores, picking up last-minute items to impress her shallow friends. I took a slow sip of the coffee. The bitter, bold taste kept me grounded. I looked at my phone resting on the glass coffee table. Exactly 55 minutes after I froze the accounts, the screen lit up. A call from Tiffany. I didn't reach for it. I just watched it ring until it went to voicemail. 10 seconds later, it rang again. Then came a frantic text. Then another desperate call. Then a call from Bradley. Then 3 texts in rapid succession. I just sat there, drinking my coffee in the fading afternoon light, watching my phone vibrate wildly on the wood table. Within 15 minutes, there were 55 missed calls. The digital panic was palpable. I could almost imagine the clerk's apologetic smile as she handed that heavy metal card back to Tiffany, telling her the transaction had been declined. I could vividly imagine her embarrassed laugh, and the way she scrambled through her designer wallet for another card she didn't have. On the 56th attempt, I finally reached out and picked up the phone. I pressed the green button and held the device to my ear. I didn't say hello. I just listened to the chaos. "Dad, what the hell is going on?" Bradley's voice exploded from the tiny speaker. He was shouting. The background noise told the story. He was in a crowded retail environment. I could hear faint classical Christmas music and the polite, hushed whispers of wealthy shoppers. Tiffany's card just got declined at Neiman's, right in front of half the country club board. It says the account is frozen. Did you forget to pay the bill? Call the bank and fix it right now. She's hiding in the dressing room crying. I took another slow sip of my coffee, savoring the absolute desperation in my son's voice. He didn't care about my health. He didn't ask if I'd made it home safely. His only concern was the sudden cutoff of his free money and the public humiliation his status-obsessed wife had suffered. "Dad, are you listening?" Bradley demanded, his tone shifting from panic to entitled rage. "Tell me you're going to fix it. We have $5,000 worth of gifts sitting at the register. The manager is looking at us like we're criminals. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is?" I let the silence stretch out for a long, painful time. I wanted him to hear the absolute dead air on my end. When I finally spoke, my voice was low and steady. "I have a very good idea of how embarrassing this is." I hung up the phone. The war had begun in silence. The rest of the evening passed in total peace. I sat in my worn leather armchair and watched the city lights flicker outside my window. For the first time in years, I slept soundly. The morning of December 24th arrived with a biting chill. I made my black coffee and waited patiently. I knew my son better than anyone. I knew he would never accept a financial defeat over a short phone call. He needed to deploy his charm and his practiced routine of manufactured fragility. It was his signature move whenever he needed my deep pockets to fix the messes he created. At exactly 9:00 a.m., a frantic knocking echoed through the quiet hallway. I set my mug on the kitchen counter and walked to the front door with deliberate calm. When I pulled it open, Bradley was standing on the mat. He looked disheveled, a stark contrast to his usual polished image. His hair was messy. His shoulders were slumped and there were dark circles under his eyes. It was a perfect performance of a man carrying the weight of the world, the exhausted, misunderstood victim. "Dad," he let out a long breath, a tremor of faked relief in his voice. "Thank God you're home. Can I come in?" I stepped aside, allowing him into my living space. He walked in, rubbing his face with his hands, perfectly playing the part of the weary victim. I closed the door, turned to face him, and kept my expression entirely neutral. "Dad, I am so sorry about yesterday," he started, pacing my small living room. "That text, the one Tiffany sent by mistake, was completely taken out of context. It was a terrible, stupid lapse in judgment." "Taken out of context?" I asked calmly, crossing my arms over my chest. "Please enlighten me. How exactly does one take finally got rid of the old man out of context?" He flinched at my directness, but quickly steadied himself. "You have to understand, Dad, Tiffany isn't in a good place right now. For the last few months, she's been struggling with severe depression and extreme anxiety. She's barely able to keep her life together. The holiday pressure has caused her mental state to deteriorate exponentially. She didn't mean you were an old man. She was just venting to her private support group about how overwhelmed she felt by family obligations. She is very fragile, Dad. She desperately needed a quiet, low-stress Christmas with just the three of us to protect her sanity. That's why I sent that message about needing space. We just didn't want to burden you with the weight of her breakdown." I listened, amazed at the sheer, staggering audacity of the lie. Tiffany's so-called fragility had never stopped her from hosting lavish cocktail parties or spending expensive weekends at luxury resorts in Aspen. As long as she could swipe my credit card at designer boutiques, her anxiety seemed to miraculously vanish. But I nodded slowly and deliberately, letting him weave his intricate web of lies. "I see," I said, dropping my voice to mimic a concerned father. I had no idea she was struggling so much behind closed doors. Bradley sighed heavily, clearly mistaking my strategic silence for emotional compromise. "It's been a living nightmare, Dad." And then yesterday afternoon, when her card was declined, she had a complete panic attack in the middle of the store. She was humiliated in front of her friends, and that leads to the real reason I'm here this morning. He stopped pacing and looked me straight in the eye with wide, pleading eyes. "Dad, I need you to do me a massive favor. I know you're furious, and you have every right to be, but I need you to unfreeze the bank accounts, even if just for today. Our holiday caterer is threatening to walk." "Caterer?" I repeated, letting a hint of genuine confusion slip into my voice. "For a quiet, low-stress Christmas dinner with just the three of you?" "Yes," Bradley replied quickly, not missing a beat in his fabricated narrative. "It's a very professional, high-end private chef service." Because of her anxiety medication, Tiffany has strict dietary restrictions. This specific chef curates organic meals to her needs, but they are demanding the final balance of $15,000 this morning, or they'll cancel the entire holiday menu. We have absolutely nothing to eat in the house. If this falls through, Tiffany is going to have a complete mental breakdown. "I'm begging you, Dad. I just need 15 grand to save our family Christmas." $15,000 for a private chef to cook a simple dinner for 3 people. The sheer, mathematical absurdity of the request hung in the dead air between us. In my 40 years of corporate negotiations, I'd seen many powerful men lie to my face for millions of dollars. But rarely had I seen someone spin a lie so sloppy, so insulting, and so transparently ridiculous. I walked past my son toward the large picture window, overlooking the busy downtown street below. I needed a moment to manage the surge of grief and disgust churning in my chest. I looked out through the cold glass, down at the curbside parking reserved for our building's visitors. Parked directly beneath my window, gleaming in the pale winter sun, was a brand new slate-gray Porsche Panamera. I stared at the car. I looked at its aggressive body lines, the custom matte black rims, and an undeniable aura of extreme performative wealth. Bradley was a mid-level project manager at a mid-sized, completely unremarkable tech company. His annual salary was decent for his age, but fundamentally, it was nowhere near enough to support a luxury sports car worth over $150,000. He couldn't afford that car. Not when I was paying the massive mortgage on the Highland Park mansion and subsidizing Tiffany's never-ending spending habits. My gut twisted into a tight, incredibly painful knot. The math in his life had completely fallen apart. I stared at the screen, the initial shock of the Ferrari rental fading into a cold, focused analysis. The pieces were no longer just a puzzle, they were a blueprint of a con. The tent, the band, the ice sculptures, and now the hired supercar. This wasn't just a party. It was a production designed to bait a specific target. The photos Vince sent confirmed it. Those aren't just any SUVs. Those are high-end transports for wealthy private equity investors or top-tier real estate developers. Bradley and Tiffany weren't just living beyond their means. They were using my assets to manufacture a fake persona, likely to pull off a massive financial scheme. They were selling the illusion of old money to people with actual, generational wealth. I tapped on the second photo from Vince. It showed a group of men in sharp, tailored suits walking up the red carpet, greeted by Tiffany, who was playing the part of the gracious, wealthy hostess to perfection. The final photo was a close-up of a large, high-end printed sign mounted on an easel near the entrance. Stanford Capital Holiday Gala, Private Equity Showcase. My blood turned to ice. Stanford Capital. They were using my family name, the name I had built with 40 years of sweat and honest manufacturing, to frame a business proposition. My son wasn't just an entitled brat. He was an imposter, using my reputation and my property as the storefront for a scam. I didn't panic. Panic was for people who didn't have a plan. I reached for my phone and called my bank's fraud department, identifying myself as the primary account holder. "I need to place an immediate hold on the sub-account ending in 4492, I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the internal fire. "And I need an emergency block on all secondary access to my primary business accounts. Someone is using my name and assets to facilitate unauthorized transactions." I wasn't just cutting off their money anymore. I was cutting off their stage. I looked back at the live security feed on my tablet. The gala was in full swing. Tiffany was laughing, holding a glass of champagne, pointing toward the back garden where the main presentation was clearly about to begin. She looked entirely untroubled, completely convinced that the old man was sitting alone in his apartment, crying over his cold coffee, blissfully unaware of the empire of lies being built on his land. She had no idea that I wasn't just watching, I was orchestrating the finale. "Vince," I typed back to my private investigator, "you're going to be the guest of honor. I'm sending you the digital access code for the main security gateway. Go to the front entrance. Don't cause a scene, but get inside. Find out exactly who is in that audience and what investment opportunity Bradley is pitching. I want every name on that guest list." I stood up from my desk and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. I had spent years trying to give Bradley the world, thinking it would fill the void of his character. I had been wrong. Wealth, when placed in the hands of the dishonest, acts as a megaphone for their worst impulses. The clock on my wall clicked to 6:00 p.m. The guests inside that mansion were about to be treated to the performance of a lifetime, but the curtain was about to fall hard. My phone buzzed again. It was a notification from the security system. "Main gate, tamper detected." Vince was inside. I sat back down, opened my laptop, and began drafting a formal, notarized letter to the local authorities and the State Securities Board, outlining the unauthorized use of my personal assets and the fraudulent use of the Stanford name. I wouldn't just be stopping a party, I would be initiating a full-scale legal intervention. They thought they had finally kicked the old man to the curb. They were about to realize that the old man was the only thing keeping the floor from collapsing beneath them. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. It was cold now, but it didn't matter. The bitter taste was the perfect accompaniment to the cold, calculated justice I was about to serve. Tonight, Bradley and Tiffany would learn that you can steal a man's money, but you can never successfully steal his legacy, because the moment you try, he will burn your borrowed kingdom to the ground. I'm done watching from the sidelines. The time for defensive maneuvers is over. They've built their stage, they've bought the costumes, and they've invited the audience. Now it's time for the final act. "Mitchell," I said, my voice cutting through the line with the cold precision of a scalpel, "you don't understand. They want to be the stars of the show. I'm going to make sure they get the biggest spotlight of their lives. I don't want you to stop them. I want you to assist them in silence." "Assist them? Rick, have you lost your mind?" "Listen to me very carefully," I continued, pacing my small office. "I want you to take that forged power of attorney, but don't flag it. Instead, I want you to draft a formal acknowledgement from the Stanford Holdings office, the shell company they think they're running, that confirms the power of attorney is active and verified as of tonight. And then, I want you to send an email to the regional bank executive who is currently sipping champagne in my garden. Make it look like a routine internal audit confirmation, sent by accident. Just a simple, one-line verification that the entity is authorized to proceed with the $12 million credit line." There was a heavy pause on the other end. "Rick, if you send that, you're basically telling the bank to move forward with the loan. That's $12 million in fraudulent debt that will be tied to your assets the moment the ink dries." "Exactly," I said, a dark smile touching my lips. I want them to commit the crime. I want them to reach out and grab that money with both hands. I want the regional bank to sign off on the funding tonight, under the impression that they're finalizing a genius investment with the Stanford legacy. The deeper they dig this hole, the less chance they have of ever crawling out. And then, Mitchell asked, his voice now a mix of apprehension and grudging respect. And then, when they're standing on that podium, toast in hand, surrounded by the city's elite, we pull the rug out from under them, not with a lawyer's letter, but with a full-blown federal intervention. I want the SEC and the local fraud division to be the ones to walk through those doors, not a process server. We are going to ensure that their gala concludes with handcuffs, not applause. I hung up the phone before Mitchell could protest again. I turned back to my tablet, watching the scene at my home. The jazz music was louder now, the guests were laughing, and Tiffany was center stage, radiant in her lies. Bradley was standing at the bar, signaling to the bank executive, looking like a man who owned the world. They were so close to the finish line of their scam. They had no idea that they were running headlong into a brick wall. I picked up my phone once more, this time dialing a number I hadn't touched in years, the direct line to the regional chief of the white-collar crime division. I didn't introduce myself as a victim of a family squabble. I introduced myself as the CEO of a company that had just uncovered a massive, multi-million-dollar corporate fraud involving impersonation, forgery, and grand larceny. I gave them the names, the evidence of the shell company, and the exact details of the forgery. I gave them a timeline of exactly when the fraudulent loan would hit its final approval stage. They listened with the intense, professional hunger of people who live to catch sharks. The setup was complete. I walked to my closet and pulled out a suit, not the comfortable clothes of a retired man, but the sharp, charcoal gray business suit I used to wear to boardrooms when I meant business. I checked my watch, 8:15 p.m., the gala was hitting its peak. I stepped out of my apartment and headed for my car. I didn't want to be watching this on a tablet anymore. I wanted to see the look on Bradley's face when he realized his father wasn't just an old man to be discarded, but the architect of his own downfall. The drive to Highland Park felt like a pilgrimage. As I pulled up to the gate, the valet, confused to see me at my own house, started to protest. I didn't say a word. I just walked past him, a ghost returning to a house that was legally still mine. I stepped into the garden. The music hit me. The smell of expensive perfume and champagne was everywhere. I wove through the crowd, an older man in a charcoal suit, blending into the shadows of the beautiful, expensive lie. I reached the edge of the tent. Tiffany was on the small stage, the microphone in her hand, smiling down at the crowd. "My husband and I are so proud to share this vision with you," she was saying, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "Stanford Capital isn't just an investment. It's a legacy of trust, built on a foundation of generational success." I stepped out of the shadows, right into the glow of the stage lights. A few people noticed me, the ones who knew my face from the early days of the company. A ripple of whispers moved through the room. Bradley turned around. His glass froze halfway to his lips. His face went from glowing pride to a sickly, ashen gray in the span of a heartbeat. "Dad," he whispered, the microphone still live. His voice echoed, distorted and shaky, across the entire garden. I didn't smile, I didn't shout. I just walked toward the stage, my eyes locked on his. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the silver subcard I'd given him earlier, and dropped it onto the silk-covered podium. It clattered like a gunshot in the sudden, terrified silence of the party. "The party's over, Bradley," I said, my voice calm enough to carry to the back of the tent. "And you're about to find out exactly what the Stanford legacy is really built on." Behind me, the sirens started. Not one, but a dozen of them, tearing through the quiet night air of Highland Park. The look in his eyes wasn't just fear anymore. It was the pure, crystalline realization that he had just signed away his life. The stage lights reflected in my eyes, bright and cold. I stood there, watching the guests scramble to the exits, and for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel lonely at all. It felt like justice. I took a long pause, letting the heavy, cold reality of my plan settle into the air around us. And then, when they're at the absolute peak of their fake victory, when they think they've finally conquered the world using the wealth they stole from me, I'm going to walk through the front door of my own home. I'm going to step right onto that perfectly manicured stage they've built, and in front of everyone they've tried to deceive, I'm going to turn their fragile empire into dust. I want all the legal filings ready for my signature by tomorrow morning, Mitchell. Every asset transfer, every eviction notice, and every formal complaint. Have the final orders ready to settle the scores of their entire lives. I will be attending that inaugural gala tomorrow night in person. I hung up the phone, letting the heavy silence of the apartment wash over me. The entire night stretched out before me, but sleep was completely out of the question. I sat in my dark office, watching the city of Dallas slowly wake up as the pale light of dawn began to creep across the skyline. I spent the last 40 years building a fortress of financial security for my family, thinking I was protecting them from the cruel realities of the world. Instead, I had unknowingly funded them to build a beautiful, terrifying machine, and my own son was joyfully preparing to pull the lever. At exactly 7:00 a.m., my phone buzzed against the polished wood table. It was another encrypted message from Vince Carter. He hadn't slept either. The message contained a massive digital file. Beneath the attachment, a brief text read: I intercepted a courier at the service entrance delivering the final presentation materials. This is the official investor packet they're handing out to guests tonight. You need to see this immediately. I downloaded the file and opened it on my large display. The screen was instantly filled with a beautifully designed, highly professional company prospectus. The cover was deep navy blue, stamped with elegant gold leaf lettering that matched the invitation Vince had photographed the day before. The title declared the venture firm to be the Stanford Legacy Fund. Below it, the text proudly announced, built on a foundation of unmatched excellence, shaping the future together. I scrolled down past the title page, skimming through polished executive summaries and aggressive, massively inflated financial projections. The document was a masterclass in corporate deception. It outlined a series of massive, high-density residential developments in the fastest-growing regions of Texas. It promised investors unprecedented returns, utilizing the reputation Stanford Industrial Refrigeration had built over 40 years as an absolute guarantee of their operational capability. They were using my spotless name to sell an empty dream. But compared to what I saw on page 4, the financial fabrications meant nothing. I stopped scrolling. My hand froze on the mouse. I stared at the screen, reading the words over and over, completely unable to process the sickening nature of the text. The heading on that page read, "A message from the managing partner." There was a professionally lit photograph of Bradley, looking somber, as he stood in front of my main manufacturing plant. Below the photo was a personal message addressed directly to potential investors. I read the first paragraph, and the air was instantly sucked from my lungs. For 40 years, my father, Richard Stanford, built an empire marked by uncompromising integrity and visionary leadership. The text began, "It is with a heavy heart that I must share a reality our family has been navigating privately over the past year. My father has unfortunately been diagnosed with early onset, rapidly progressing Alzheimer's. As his cognitive abilities have steadily declined, we had to move him to a specialized, full-time memory care facility, where he can receive the around-the-clock medical attention he now requires. A cold, paralyzing numbness crept from my chest down to my fingertips. I stared at the words, tracing every single letter. Late-stage Alzheimer, S. Memory care facility, cognitive decline. The text continued, dripping with sickening, manufactured bravery. Following this devastating personal tragedy, the burden of taking up the torch fell upon my shoulders. Before he lost his memory completely, my father legally and explicitly entrusted me with the control of the Stanford family legacy. He charged me with protecting our assets and carrying our vision into the future. The Stanford Legacy Fund is the culmination of his final wish. My solemn mission is to build an investment portfolio that reflects his unmatched standards of excellence, honoring his life's work. My stomach cramped violently. The sociopathic scale of this lie was beyond human comprehension. They weren't just asking me to leave my house for a gala. They weren't just stealing $3 million with forged documents. They were officially, publicly, and legally declaring me mentally dead. The puzzle pieces locked together with terrifying certainty. This was exactly why Mitchell had discovered those fraudulent power of attorney documents. Bradley hadn't just forged my signature. He had undoubtedly forged an entire set of medical records to go with it. He had submitted those fake medical evaluations to the bank to justify why the powerful founder of Stanford Industrial Refrigeration would suddenly hand over full control of his assets. He had created a tragic, sympathetic narrative to manipulate regional bank executives into fast-tracking a $12 million commercial loan. That explained the most heartbreaking detail of all. It explained why they needed me out of the Highland Park mansion. How could they be selling my tragic diagnosis to a room full of powerful investors, while the supposedly brain-damaged, incapacitated family patriarch was walking around the living room perfectly healthy, handing his guests a glass of wine? It was impossible. I was an active threat to their narrative. My physical presence would instantly shatter the multi-million-dollar illusion they had built. So, they orchestrated a petty emotional argument. They used my deep love for them to make me feel unwelcome, driving me away so they could safely host a funeral for me in my own house and inherit my empire while I was still breathing. I leaned back in my chair, the light of the monitor illuminating the deep darkness of my office. This betrayal was so deep, so fundamentally evil, that it bypassed standard anger entirely. It settled into a crystal-clear, icy calm. They had stripped away my existence as a human, reducing my entire life to a tragic story designed to solicit venture capital from the wealthy elite of Dallas. Tiffany, while explaining my fictional diagnosis to a city council member by the ice sculpture, likely even squeezed out a few genuine, pathetic tears. They were showing off a living corpse to line their own pockets. I looked at the digital clock in the corner of the screen. It was 8:15 a.m. The inaugural Founders Gala was set to begin at 7:00 p.m. tonight. I had about 11 hours left to complete the final preparations for the complete destruction of their lives. I closed the fraudulent prospectus and opened a secure communication channel directly to Mitchell Harper. My fingers flew across the keyboard with mechanical, merciless precision. I instructed Mitchell to contact his most aggressive, seasoned litigation partners immediately. I needed subpoenas for those forged medical records right now. I ordered him to draft a comprehensive dossier of their criminal fraud, including the intercepted pitch documents, the illegal vehicle leases, and the unauthorized corporate credit withdrawals. I told him to prepare for a scorched earth legal strike. We weren't going to negotiate. We were going to dismantle them entirely. Then I stood up and walked into the bedroom. I opened my closet and took out my finest custom Italian suit. It was a deep, imposing charcoal gray, the exact suit I wore when I executed hostile corporate takeovers. I laid it out carefully on the bed, pairing it with a crisp white shirt and a solid black silk tie. I walked into the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror. My eyes were sharp, bright, and completely devoid of the shadow of the sad, accommodating father who had handed over his credit cards 24 hours ago. Bradley and Tiffany had spent the last 3 years humiliating me behind closed doors, treating me like a disposable asset. Over the last week, they had actively planned a narrative about my mental decline to steal everything I had built over 40 years. They were currently standing in my home, preparing to tell a room full of powerful investors that Richard Stanford had become a tragic memory locked away in a medical facility. I splashed cold water on my face and dried it with a towel. They wanted a narrative, they wanted a show. Then I would give them a show they would never forget. The Founders Gala was about to have an uninvited keynote speaker. The dead man was coming back to life, and he was bringing the absolute fires of judgment with him. I smoothed out my charcoal suit. For decades, I had worn this suit while crushing arrogant competitors and dissecting fraudulent mergers. I never imagined I would wear it to execute the destruction of my own flesh and blood, but Bradley had crossed the line. He had tried to erase my existence. I grabbed my keys and walked out without looking back. The drive to Highland Park was completely quiet. I drove toward a dim municipal parking lot 2 miles from the estate, our designated meeting point. I saw 3 cars parked in a covert formation. The first was Mitchell Harper's silver sedan. The second was Vince Carter's black SUV. The third was an unmarked police cruiser. I parked and stepped out into the crisp winter air. Mitchell and Vince stood between their cars, flanked by 2 burly men in dark tactical jackets. As I approached, Mitchell stepped forward. "Rick," he said, using a professional tone, "these are Detectives Miller and Hayes from the Financial Crimes Unit. We've briefed them on the situation, and they've reviewed the preliminary digital files I sent over." I shook hands with the 2 detectives. They looked at me like I was a key asset in a criminal bust. "Mr. Stanford," Detective Miller began in a serious tone, "your attorney has outlined a series of deeply disturbing events. We investigate corporate embezzlement every day, but frankly, the brazen fraud your son is attempting to pull off tonight is unprecedented. If the documents your team provided are accurate, we're looking at multiple felony charges for wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. Before entering the property, we need to verify the physical evidence. We can't interrupt a gathering with city officials present without ironclad proof." "I completely understand," I replied. I walked to the back of the car and popped the trunk. A portable light illuminated the interior, casting a harsh glow on a heavy leather briefcase. I snapped open the locks, pulled out a stack of organized documents, and laid them on the hood of Mitchell's sedan. "Gentlemen, we aren't relying on digital copies or verbal accusations," I stated clearly. "We are going to build an impenetrable wall of facts right here." I handed the first document to Detective Hayes. "This is the original deed to the Highland Park property with the notary seal," I explained. "I am the sole legal owner of that estate. Bradley and Tiffany Stanford are only listed as temporary residents. They have no legal authority to host a commercial investment gala at that venue. I have the absolute legal right to walk through that door tonight." Hayes checked the embossed seal on the deed and handed the document to his partner. I pulled out a bound medical file and placed it on the hood. "This," I continued, "is a certified medical evaluation from my primary care physician dated less than 3 weeks ago. The results clearly certify that my physical and mental health are perfectly fine. There are no signs of cognitive decline, no memory loss, and certainly no late-stage Alzheimer's. The narrative my son is selling to those wealthy investors is a malicious fabrication whose sole purpose is to steal my identity and legitimize his fraudulent corporate takeover." Mitchell stepped forward, holding the most devastating evidence. "And this is the smoking gun, officers," Mitchell said, sliding a sheet of paper across the hood. "This is the forged power of attorney document. Bradley forged the executive signature, bypassing the high-level security protocols of Stanford Industrial Refrigeration. He forged his father's signature to authorize a $3 million commercial loan. He funneled those stolen funds into a holding account to fund the fake real estate venture firm he's launching tonight. He is literally using stolen money and forged medical records to solicit millions from powerful regional bankers." Detective Miller shone his flashlight on the forged signature. He carefully compared it to the real signatures on my medical documents and the deed. After a minute of intense scrutiny, Miller clicked off the flashlight and looked me in the eye. "The evidence is absolutely airtight, Mr. Stanford," the detective said, his voice carrying professional gravity. "This is a highly coordinated criminal conspiracy involving millions of dollars. We have enough probable cause to obtain an immediate arrest warrant for Bradley Stanford and anyone actively assisting him in this financial fraud." "Excellent," I replied. "So what's our tactical plan? How do we execute the entry?" Detective Hayes leaned against the car. "We have 2 patrol units on standby 3 blocks away," he explained. "At my signal, they're ready to move. However, given that there are high-profile city officials at this event, we need a quiet, surgical intervention. If we rush in with sirens blaring, it'll cause mass panic and give your son the chance to destroy the evidence. We need to get inside, secure the perimeter, and corner the suspects before they realize the trap is closing." "I have a better idea," I said calmly. "Bradley and Tiffany spent thousands hiring elite security just to keep me out. They're terrified that my physical presence will shatter their illusion. If the police show up at the front door, they'll stall you. But if I walk through that door, the shock will paralyze them completely." I looked at Mitchell, then at the 2 detectives. "I'll walk in first," I instructed. "I'll pass their security checkpoint. I'll walk straight into the main ballroom and confront my son in front of every investor he's trying to scam. I'll force him to explain how I miraculously recovered from late-stage amnesia. I'll make him choke on his own lies in public. And the moment he realizes his entire fake empire is collapsing, that's when you walk into the room and put him in handcuffs. I want him completely disgraced." Mitchell let out a slow breath. "Rick, this is extremely dangerous. If you corner him in front of everyone, he might react with violence." "He won't get the chance," I countered, "because Vince will be right behind me." Vince stepped out of the shadows with a dangerous smile on his lips. "I've memorized the floor plan, Mr. Stanford," the investigator rasped. "I can slip in through the catering entrance and secure the main hallway before the security team even knows we're inside. No one is laying a hand on you." Detective Miller and his partner exchanged a knowing look. "We can't officially support a civilian-initiated confrontation," he stated formally. "However, as you are the legal owner of the property, we can't stop you from entering your own home. We'll give you exactly 5 minutes inside. After 5 minutes, we will breach the doors and secure the scene. If things escalate within those 5 minutes, we will take immediate action. Do we have an understanding, Mr. Stanford?" "We have a perfect understanding, detective," I replied. I closed the heavy leather briefcase. The crisp snap of the brass locks rang out in the quiet night. The firing squad was assembled. The trap was perfectly set. I was about to personally dismantle the life of the boy I had raised. There was no emotion left in this, only cold, ruthless, necessary justice. I opened the car door and looked back at the team one last time. "Let's go crash a party." I sat in the plush leather passenger seat of Mitchell's luxury sedan. The heavy door closed with a muffled, satisfying thud, instantly cutting off the biting winter wind and the chaotic ambient noise of the surrounding city. Detectives Miller and Hayes led the way in their unmarked cruiser, their headlights sweeping a wide arc across the dark pavement. Vince Carter followed closely in his fully blacked-out SUV, moving through the night like a ghost. Mitchell put the car in gear and smoothly joined the quiet procession. We drove through the wide streets of Dallas in an absolute, suffocating silence. The climate-controlled cabin felt heavy, pressing on my chest like a physical weight. I watched the brilliant city lights blur on the tinted windows, transforming into ribbons of brilliant gold and deep red. Every mile we drove brought me closer to completely and irreversibly destroying the fragile family structure I had spent 40 years carefully building and protecting. I laid my hands flat on the fabric of my lap. They were perfectly, undeniably steady. The chaotic storm of raw anger and deep betrayal had passed completely, leaving behind a landscape of cold, barren, and utterly ruthless clarity. I was no longer a grieving, desperate father clinging to the illusion of a loving son. I was an instrument of pure consequence. As our small convoy merged onto the highway leading to the wealthy neighborhood of Highland Park, my thoughts drifted away from the immediate tactical situation. They traveled back against the relentless river of time, resting gently on the beautiful memories of my late wife, Beverly. Beverly had always been the gentle, profoundly grounded force of my entire life. She was a woman of deep, quiet elegance and absolutely firm moral principles. I closed my eyes, vividly painting her face in the darkness, recalling her gentle laugh and the incredibly intense, protective light that burned in her eyes whenever she looked at our only son. Her love for Bradley carried a near-sacred intensity, but she also possessed an incredibly sharp, pragmatic wisdom. And in the long, lonely years since her sudden passing, I had foolishly and stubbornly ignored that wisdom. When Bradley was a little boy struggling with the natural, inevitable consequences of the mistakes he made in his youth, Beverly always strongly advocated for strict accountability. She believed fundamentally that facing personal suffering was the only crucible for building true character. I clearly remember a specific afternoon decades ago. Bradley was a teenager at the time, and he had intentionally shattered a priceless stained glass window of a neighbor's house, shamelessly lying that he wasn't involved. Beverly grabbed him by the ear, marched him directly to the neighbor's porch, forced him to look the person in the eye and sincerely apologize, and use his own meager savings to pay for the expensive glass replacement. That night, under the dim light of our kitchen, she looked at me with extreme seriousness and told me, if we always shielded him from the necessary pain of his own choices, we would inevitably raise a weak, entitled man, a man who thought the world owed him endless forgiveness. She had warned me with a terrifying, prophetic accuracy. And the soulless monster she warned me about was exactly who I was driving across the city to destroy. I stared out into the vast night, speaking silently and directly to her haunting memory in the quiet corner of my own mind. I am truly, deeply sorry, Beverly, I whispered internally. I am so sorry that I let overwhelming grief blind me to his true, calculating nature. When you tragically left us, the heavy silence in that huge, empty house was something I couldn't handle alone. I desperately tried to fill the massive void you left behind by meeting every demand he ever made without hesitation. I pathetically confused financial generosity with true fatherly love. I mistook providing endless material support for fulfilling my true duty as a strong father. I truly thought that by ensuring our son never had to struggle for anything, never had to worry about paying a bill, and never had to face the cold, ruthless reality of the cruel business world we conquered together, I was honoring your beautiful memory. But in my desperate, misguided attempt to give him a perfect life, I systematically and thoroughly dismantled his internal moral compass. Every time I silently paid off the debts he kept accumulating, Every time I joyfully funded another luxury vacation. Every time I weakly accepted an empty apology instead of demanding true responsibility. I was actively laying another solid brick in the foundation of his immense, infinite arrogance. I cushioned every fall of his adult life with soft padding. I deliberately created a false world where his reckless actions had absolutely no negative consequences. I personally created this predator, entitled, ruthless, and dangerous. And he, standing in our former home, is actively trying to steal the massive business empire we built with our own blood, sweat, and endless tears. The heavy rubber tires hummed a steady, hypnotic rhythm against the smooth asphalt of the highway. Tonight, that endless cushion of comfort finally stops. Tonight, he is going to fall hard onto the cold, unforgiving concrete. I won't allow him to drag your beautiful legacy into his own swamp of greed. I won't allow him to use the highly respected company we built from scratch to maliciously defraud innocent investors. I will actively strip away the fake armor I so foolishly provided him, and I will force him to stand completely naked and entirely alone under the terrifying, heavy pressure of the law. I am going to break him, both legally and socially, Beverly. This isn't out of malicious revenge, but because this is the last, true act of parental love I can offer him. It is the only way left to permanently balance the scales of justice. As our convoy finally approached the tree-lined main road of the Highland Park district, our speed slowed significantly. Mitchell tapped the leather steering wheel nervously, his eyes locked on the dark road ahead. "We're about 2 minutes from the target, Rick," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the heavy, suffocating silence inside the car. "The police cruiser will deploy strategically at the dark end of the block. Vince is heading directly to the rear service entrance on foot. Are you truly, absolutely, undeniably ready to face this confrontation?" I looked out the window at the massive, extremely expensive estates sliding slowly past us. Their meticulously arranged, flashing holiday light shows were actively mocking the deep, heavy darkness building in the depths of my hollow chest. "In my entire life, I have never been more ready for anything," I replied calmly. The sleek car turned smoothly onto my familiar street. The spectacular sight of that glowing, chaotic, and absolutely massive inaugural Founders Gala finally appeared directly, undeniably, and blindingly in my view. It signaled that the inevitable ending had surely and firmly pulled back its curtain. At exactly 8:30 p.m., Mitchell pulled the sedan into the long, circular driveway of my Highland Park estate. The entire property had been completely transformed, bathed in the harsh, bright glare of professional event lighting that dyed the stone exterior icy blue and brilliant white. A team of valet parkers in crisp red jackets scrambled to manage a never-ending stream of luxury vehicles. Meanwhile, the deep, resonant bass of a 12-piece live jazz band vibrated in the crisp winter air. It was a masterpiece of manufactured prestige, a flawlessly executed illusion designed to blind Dallas's wealthiest investors, keeping them from seeing the absolute, empty truth hidden beneath it. I stepped out of the car, and the cold night wind hit my face like a sobering electric shock. Mitchell walked immediately by my right side, gripping the heavy leather briefcase containing the absolute proof of my son's destruction. Detectives Miller and Hayes stepped out of their cruiser, moving with a quiet, intimidating gait, the stride of men who knew exactly how tonight was going to end. Vince Carter emerged from the shadows of the manicured hedges, giving a short nod to indicate the perimeter was completely secured, and the service staff were entirely unaware of our arrival. Together, we walked up the broad stone steps as an unstoppable unit. 2 private security guards, hired by my son with stolen money, stood firmly at the bottom of the massive steps. They were wearing dark suits and earpieces, their hands resting cautiously near their belts. As I approached, The taller guard stepped forward, raising a hand to block my path. He opened his mouth to demand an invitation, but his words died instantly in his throat. Detective Miller smoothly pulled out his gold police badge and held it up under the glare of the event lights. The guard swallowed hard, his eyes flickering between the badge and my cold, unyielding expression. I didn't even break my stride. I walked right past him, ascending the steps of this house I had bought with my own blood and sweat. The massive, custom-carved oak double doors were left half open to allow the warm air and lively music to spill out into the night. Through the narrow gap, I could see the grand foyer and the spacious ballroom beyond. It was packed with the absolute elite of Dallas society. I saw regional bank executives, prominent municipal judges, and wealthy real estate developers, all dressed in flawless evening gowns and bespoke tuxedos. Servers in crisp white uniforms wove through the crowded room, carrying silver trays filled with vintage champagne and decadent hors d'oeuvres. This was the absolute climax of the gala. The heavy lifting of the initial lobbying was giving way to the intoxicating rush of collective celebration. Bradley stood at the absolute center of the room, on a slightly elevated, makeshift mahogany stage. He was wearing a tuxedo that probably cost more than his first car, holding a crystal glass high in the air. Standing beside him was Tiffany, draped in a shimmering, floor-length designer gown, radiating the manufactured pride of a newly crowned queen. Bradley was speaking, his voice amplified through a hidden microphone system, projecting a smooth, self-assured charisma. It made my stomach churn with absolute nausea. He was wrapping up a toast, thanking the power brokers present for placing their ultimate trust in the Stanford Legacy Fund, clearly promising them that the brilliant, unmatched vision of his tragically incapacitated father would be carried forward through his own bold, new leadership. The crowd offered polite, sympathetic murmurs, raising their own glasses in tribute to this noble son who had taken up the heavy mantle of the fallen patriarch. I placed my hands flat against the heavy oak of the massive double doors. I took one last deep breath, anchoring myself completely in the cold, hard reality of the action I was about to take. Then I pushed with a sudden, violent force, shoving the massive doors wide open. They swung inward with a heavy, teeth-grinding creak. The sound sharply cut through the background noise of the party. I stepped fully into the bright lights of the grand foyer, flanked tightly by Mitchell, Detective Miller, and Detective Hayes. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, like an undeniably living ghost radiating absolute authority. The effect was immediate and entirely catastrophic. The lead trumpeter of the live jazz band caught sight of the police out of the corner of his eye and cracked on a high note. The drummer faltered, and within 3 agonizing seconds, the entire 12-piece band ground to a halt amid a mess of chaotic, discordant noise. The sudden, unnatural silence was absolute and deafening. The only things breaking the quiet were the slight, nervous rustling of expensive fabric. 200 pairs of eyes shifted away from the stage and locked onto the entrance. The crowd instinctively parted, creating a wide, clear path from the front door to the mahogany stage. Bradley froze mid-sentence. His mouth was slightly open, his left hand still gripped tightly around the microphone. He looked out over the crowd, his gaze locking directly with mine. I watched the color drain from his face within seconds, leaving a sickly, ash-gray pallor. He didn't see a sick old man who didn't know better. He saw the creator who was about to destroy him. The crystal champagne glass slipped from his trembling right hand. It fell through the heavy silence of the room, smashing onto the polished marble floor with a sharp, explosive shatter that echoed like a gunshot. Bubbles splashed onto the tips of his expensive shoes. Tiffany, standing perfectly rigid beside him, turned as pale as a fresh sheet of paper. Her perfectly manicured hands flew to her mouth. and in the dead-silent ballroom, her frantic, panicked whisper was carried clearly through the open microphone. "He's supposed to be locked away," she hissed, her voice trembling with absolute terror. A collective gasp went through the crowd immediately. As the immense weight of her accidental confession washed over the room, the regional bank executive who had been nodding along to Bradley just minutes earlier slowly set down his glass, his expression hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. I began to walk down the central aisle the crowd had parted. My footsteps echoed on the marble, my gaze locked firmly on the stage. I didn't look at the city councilman, nor did I acknowledge the shocked socialites whispering frantically to one another. My attention was occupied entirely by the pathetic, trembling figure of my son. He retreated half a step involuntarily, his back hitting the edge of the massive presentation screen, which still proudly displayed the logo of his fake empire. The grand illusion was thoroughly shattered, exposing the hollow, rotting core beneath his ambition. I stopped at the bottom of the stage and looked up at the boy who had tried to bury me alive. I was back to reclaim my life, and the heavy, merciless execution of justice had officially begun. I didn't even disrupt my steady pace, paying no mind to the shattered glass around my son. My eyes stayed locked on the mahogany stage as I walked smoothly up the 3 small steps. Bradley cowered instinctively in front of the giant presentation screen, his breathing short and urgent. I reached out and calmly took the black microphone from his trembling fingers. He didn't offer a shred of resistance, his hands shaking violently as he surrendered the mic. I turned my back to him, facing the ocean of shocked faces, and tapped the mic twice to ensure it was fully functional. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I said, projecting a warm, welcoming tone that echoed clearly through the silent ballroom. "Please forgive my completely unexpected interruption of your grand evening. I am Richard Stanford, founder and CEO of Stanford Industrial Refrigeration. I am also the sole legal owner of this beautiful Highland Park estate you are currently enjoying. It is an immense honor to finally meet everyone tonight, especially since I had absolutely no idea that my own house was being used to host a founders gala for a real estate investment fund I never authorized." A murmur of genuine confusion rippled instantly through the dense crowd. The powerful regional bank executive in the front row frowned deeply. His sharp gaze flickered back and forth between my extremely composed face and the extreme fear on my son's expression. Tiffany suddenly rushed forward, stepping directly into the bright stage lights. Her face wore a mask of frantic, sudden damage control. "Please forgive my father-in-law," she shouted to the gathered investors, her voice dripping with thick, fake sympathy. "Unfortunately, his severe dementia has made him aggressive and completely confused about the true nature of where he is tonight." She reached out a gentle hand, as if to safely guide a completely lost patient back to a hospital ward. "We are very, very sorry for this disturbing scene," she continued, playing the role of a tragically burdened caregiver. "Bradley is bravely bearing the immense pressure of his father's slow memory fade, and we only wanted to celebrate the bright new future of the Stanford family quietly tonight, without causing him any unnecessary distress. Please, let our private security escort him back to his secure medical transport, so we can resume the lovely evening we had originally planned." I stared at her, feeling a cold, absolute disgust wash over my rigid body. I didn't blink, and I didn't lower the microphone. "My cognitive abilities are functioning perfectly, Tiffany," I stated clearly, my voice cutting through her pathetic performance like a sharpened blade. "I am perfectly sober, completely lucid, and have absolute control over all my mental faculties. In fact, I am perfectly aware that my ambitious son forged a legal power of attorney to steal $3 million from my main corporate accounts to illegally fund this ridiculous, fraudulent gala you are currently hosting." The crowd exploded instantly into a chaotic frenzy of suffocating whispers and shocked exclamations. The bank executive stepped back deliberately, immediately creating physical distance from the stage. Bradley finally found his voice, stepping forward to try and save his rapidly burning empire. "Don't listen to him," Bradley shouted in desperation, his face flushing deep red from extreme panic. "He's having a severe, violent mental health episode. The doctors warned us this would happen. He doesn't even know what year it is or where he is right now. He's completely disconnected from objective reality." At that exact moment, Mitchell Harper stepped decisively out of the shadows near the grand entrance. My trusted attorney walked smoothly down the center aisle, holding the heavy leather briefcase tightly at his side. He reached the absolute front row of the gathered VIP investors and expertly unlatched the brass locks. Without a moment's hesitation, Mitchell began pulling out a thick stack of freshly printed, certified legal documents. He handed the first highly detailed packet directly to the stunned regional bank executive, ensuring the bold, black medical stamps were immediately visible to anyone within 3 feet. "What you are holding," Mitchell announced, his voice projecting a sharp, commanding legal authority, "is a fully certified, exhaustive medical evaluation. It was completed just 3 weeks ago by a top neurologist, Dr. Iris Thorne. It provides absolute, irrefutable medical proof that Mr. Richard Stanford shows no signs of cognitive decline. Attached directly behind that medical certification is the original deed to this property, which confirms Richard Stanford is the sole legal owner. The man standing on that stage has absolutely no legal authority to conduct commercial investment activities on this highly protected, private residential property." The bank executive flipped quickly through the thick pages. As he realized the staggering depth of the scam, his jaw tightened into a line of furious, unyielding resolve. He glared viciously at Bradley. Any remnants of professional courtesy vanished from his expression. "You submitted fraudulent medical records to my financial institution," the executive stated, his voice filled with dangerous, righteous anger. "You explicitly claimed your father was permanently confined to a secure medical unit. You used that fabricated story as the justification for a $12 million request. You just dared to attempt committing massive federal bank fraud right in front of me." The surrounding guests began to erupt in furious murmurs. They retreated physically, pulling away from the mahogany stage as if Bradley had suddenly developed a highly contagious, fatal disease. Mitchell pulled another heavy document from the briefcase and held it in the air like a final death warrant. "And this," Mitchell continued, his voice echoing like a final bell, "is the illegally forged power of attorney. Bradley forged an executive signature to steal $3 million directly from the core operating accounts of Stanford Industrial Refrigeration. This entire so-called elite real estate fund is nothing more than a shell built entirely on stolen capital." Bradley froze in place, his eyes wide and completely vacant. The grand illusion he had spent months desperately and meticulously constructing evaporated into thin air in less than 60 seconds. Tiffany covered her face with her shimmering hands, letting out a loud, pathetic sob. But the sobbing was completely ignored by the angry investors now demanding immediate answers. I raised the microphone again, feeling not a shred of leftover pity for the man crumbling beside me. "I gave you absolutely everything, Bradley," I said calmly into the mic. My voice resonated deeply against the high ceilings of this vast, beautiful ballroom. "I provided you with an affluent lifestyle, endless corporate opportunities, and complete financial security. But instead of showing true gratitude or carving out an honest path, you decided to legally erase my entire existence. You actively weaponized the pure memory of your mother and my unwavering fatherly love to execute a malicious corporate takeover. You aren't a visionary founder, Bradley. You're just a pathetic thief in a stolen tuxedo. I lowered the microphone, letting the pure reality of those harsh words settle heavily over the rapidly dissolving wreckage of this short-lived, fake commercial empire. My next words didn't need the microphone. The silence in the ballroom was so absolute, so thick and suffocating, that my natural voice carried effortlessly to the farthest corners of the room. I moved my attention away from my trembling shell of a son and faced the ocean of elite Dallas investors directly. I need you all to understand exactly what you were invited to buy into tonight, I stated, pacing slowly along the edge of the mahogany stage. The Stanford Legacy Fund does not exist. There is no real estate portfolio. There are no high-density residential developments waiting for approval. The entire foundation of this exclusive joint venture is built on a catastrophic act of criminal forgery. Just 48 hours ago, the man behind me forged a legal power of attorney document. He used that fraudulent paper to illegally withdraw $3 million from the core operating accounts of my primary manufacturing business. I pointed toward the extravagant decor. Everything you see here tonight, from the vintage champagne in your crystal glasses to the beautiful ice sculptures melting in the courtyard, was paid for with stolen corporate funds. He didn't invite you here to offer some visionary investment opportunity. He invited you here to make you active participants in a felony. He needed your institutional cash to fill the massive gap he just blew into my company's balance sheet. You are not respected partners in a profitable new venture. You are unsuspecting lambs being led to slaughter in a desperate, deeply illegal Ponzi scheme. The response from the room was immediate and explosive. The polite, polished veneer of Dallas high society was shattered instantly, replaced by a raw, chaotic panic. These men and women protected their wealth with cold efficiency, and I had just informed them. They were standing in the absolute center of a federal crime scene. A prominent commercial real estate developer in the second row, a man who had been chatting happily with Tiffany 20 minutes ago, slammed his champagne glass onto a passing server's silver tray with enough force to crack the fragile crystal. I wrote a $250,000 check during cocktail hour, the developer roared, his face turning purple with rage as he charged the stage. I demand that check be voided and returned to my hand right now, Stanford, or I'll be calling my legal team before I even get to the valet. His shouting acted as the ultimate catalyst. The room erupted in deafening shouts of anger and panic. Other investors began to shout over one another, demanding the immediate return of their signed commitment letters and initial deposit checks. Men in expensive tuxedos abandoned their absolute professional etiquette, shoving each other frantically toward the cloakroom and the front exit. The grand foyer, which had been a scene of elegant celebration minutes ago, quickly devolved into an intensely congested bottleneck, the wealthy elite desperate to escape a sinking ship. I watched the social elite of the city turn their focus entirely on Bradley and Tiffany, with breathtaking speed and ferocity. The socialites who had once flattered Tiffany's custom gowns now looked at her with pure, unmasked disgust. They pulled their expensive fabrics away physically, as if the slightest contact with her would infect them with poverty and criminal liability. The regional bank executive, still holding the ironclad proof of the forged medical records, stalked toward the stage. Amidst the rising noise, he didn't even bother to raise his voice. He just stared intensely at Bradley, pointing a stiff, accusing finger directly at my son's chest. "In this city, you are completely finished," the executive stated with cold, absolute certainty. "I will personally ensure that every financial institution in Texas blacklists your name. You won't be able to get a loan for a cup of coffee, let alone a multi-million-dollar commercial project." Bradley seemed to shrink physically under the overwhelming weight of the executive's promise. He stumbled backward, his shoulders slumping. The slick, arrogant charm he had wielded like a weapon all night was gone. He looked like a frightened, lost child who had just been caught red-handed in a dangerous game of dress-up. Tiffany completely abandoned the role of the devoted, tragic caregiver she had been playing. She grabbed the sleeve of Bradley's expensive jacket, shaking his arm violently. "Do something," she screamed, her voice shrill and piercing amidst the roar of the fleeing guests. "Tell them it's a misunderstanding. Fix this right now." But Bradley couldn't fix it. He couldn't charm his way out of hard, undeniable physical evidence. He just stared blankly at the floor, completely paralyzed by the catastrophic reality of his own actions. I turned my head slightly for one last look at my son. He collapsed heavily beside the glowing digital presentation screen, looking completely broken and defeated, while his wife continued to berate him with sharp, panicked insults. They were drowning in the same relentless reality they had spent their entire adult lives desperately trying to avoid. The soft, opulent cushion I had provided for decades was permanently removed, and the hard concrete of absolute responsibility was crashing into them at a terrifying speed. I stood perfectly still at the edge of the stage, my hands resting comfortably at my sides, watching as the fake empire they had tried to build on my grave was destroyed, thoroughly and without reservation. The heavy, ornate chandeliers cast long, dramatic shadows in the emptying ballroom, illuminating the discarded champagne glasses and brochures dropped carelessly on the polished marble floor. The illusion of carefully constructed generational wealth and corporate inheritance had been thoroughly, publicly gutted. Mitchell Harper walked up to stand beside me. In the chaotic storm of fleeing investors, his presence was a calm, steady anchor. "The police have officially locked down all exterior exits," Mitchell murmured quietly, ensuring only I could hear him over the noise of the crowd. "Detectives Miller and Hayes have requested that we clear the immediate area of the stage. They are prepared to move in and execute the arrest warrants. The Financial Crimes Unit is already contacting the relevant banking authorities to freeze those stolen $3 million before they can be moved from the holding account." I nodded slowly, acknowledging the lawyer's tactical update. The operation was proceeding with flawless, surgical precision. I looked out over the spacious, beautiful grand ballroom I had purchased to provide a secure, luxurious shelter for my family. It was tainted, twisted into a theater of malicious fraud. But the cleansing process had finally begun. The parasitic infection that had taken root in my family and company was about to be forcibly extracted. I felt not a single shred of sadness, no lingering regrets, and not a trace of hesitation in my hardened heart. I only felt a cold, necessary, and completely justified sense of satisfaction. It belonged to a man who had finally stopped avoiding a deeply painful truth and had firmly decided to face it with absolute, unyielding, and indestructible strength. The process of leaving the grand ballroom tonight was a spectacle of absolute cowardice and rapid self-preservation. Those regional power brokers and wealthy socialites who had just been drinking my stolen champagne and praising my son were now shoving each other out the door. No one wanted to be in the room when federal agents started asking questions about a fraudulent $12 million commercial loan. Servers and event staff dumped silver trays onto catering tables and vanished silently through the service corridors. In less than 5 minutes, the massive space was completely empty, save for the shattered crystal glasses scattered across the floor and the ice sculpture melting into tears on the polished marble. The lively energy of the jazz band was replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed into the room like a physical weight. I stood at the bottom of the mahogany stage, my posture extremely rigid, watching the dust settle over the ruins of their grand lie. Mitchell Harper stood to my right, clutching his briefcase, wearing a mask of detachment. Detectives Miller and Hayes moved slowly to secure the perimeter, standing between the stage and the main exit, preventing any sudden attempts to escape. Vince Carter drifted in the background like a silent, vigilant shadow, ensuring no one else entered the private estate. Bradley still slumped heavily against the glowing presentation screen, his breathing shallow and faint. The expensive custom tuxedo he wore now looked laughable, like a cheap costume on a frightened little boy. He slid down the screen until his knees hit the hard stage floor. He buried his face in his trembling hands, and a loud, massive sob tore through the painful silence of the ballroom. "Dad," he choked out, his voice turning into a pathetic, whimpering whine that echoed painfully against the high ceilings. "Dad, please, I am so sorry." It was never meant to go this far. It just spiraled out of control. I wanted to build something massive. I wanted to take the Stanford name to the next level. I wanted to prove to you that I could be a visionary, that I could manage institutional investment portfolios. I looked down at him, feeling not a single flicker of pity. "You didn't want to build a legacy, Bradley," I stated, my voice echoing with cold, hard precision. "You wanted a shortcut. You wanted the respect and massive wealth that comes from 40 years of hard sacrifice, but you absolutely refused to do the actual work. You chose to erase your own father, forge medical documents, and steal $3 million from the company that had fed you your entire life. You didn't make a simple mistake. You executed a calculated, malicious criminal conspiracy." Tiffany, who had been completely frozen by extreme terror, suddenly came to life. The self-preservation instinct of a veteran social climber kicked in violently. She smoothed the front of her designer gown, took a deliberate, massive step away from her kneeling husband. "Richard," she pleaded. Her voice trembled with fake innocence as she looked me directly in the eye. "You have to understand, I knew nothing about the forged power of attorney. I swear to you. Bradley told me you had willingly set up a trust for us to launch this project. He told me the doctor had indeed given you that diagnosis, and that you wanted us to take over public responsibilities. He lied to me, too. He manipulated both of us." Bradley jerked his head up, staring at his wife in complete shock. "Tiffany, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice cracking with new panic. "You were in the room when we were drafting the pitch deck. You even used the stolen company credit card to pay the graphic designer yourself." "Shut up, Bradley," she hissed viciously, completely stripping away the facade of innocence. "I am not going to federal prison because you were too stupid to cover your own tracks. I am not letting your extreme incompetence ruin my life." I raised my right hand, a single motion instantly silencing their pathetic bickering. "I have zero interest in watching you tear each other apart for the sake of self-preservation," I announced, my tone absolutely cold and unyielding. "The physical evidence my legal team painstakingly organized details both of your signatures, both of your financial authorizations, and your shared, undeniable complicity in this entire fraudulent operation. You are both equally vicious, and you both must bear full, equal responsibility for the absolute destruction you brought into this house." I turned my head slightly and nodded toward the two officers waiting patiently in the center aisle. Detectives Miller and Hayes stepped forward, their heavy leather boots clicking rhythmically on the marble floor. They walked straight up the short steps, flanking my son on the mahogany stage. "Bradley Stanford," Detective Miller said, his voice carrying the heavy, irrefutable weight of the law. "We are formally arresting you on charges of grand larceny, wire fraud, and criminal forgery of legal financial documents. We have contacted the relevant regional banking authorities, and the $3 million you illegally transferred from Stanford Industrial Refrigeration has been officially frozen." As Detective Hayes grabbed Bradley's shoulder, forcing him to stand, Bradley let out a hollow, painful gasp. The crisp, metallic click of cold steel handcuffs echoed through the massive ballroom, the most satisfying sound I had heard in 3 years. Tiffany backed away until she was pressed tightly against the wall at the far end of the stage. As she watched her husband being bound like a common criminal, her chest heaved with complete, uncontrollable panic. I stepped onto the stage, shortening the final physical distance between me and the woman who had happily plotted my institutional, social death, so she could ruthlessly steal my life savings. "The detectives will escort Bradley to a secure holding cell downtown," I told her, my voice remaining low, steady, and terrifyingly calm. "You will undergo a thorough investigation, and an arrest warrant for you will likely be processed within the next 48 hours. However, right now, I have a very specific, non-negotiable instruction for you regarding this property." Tiffany stared at me, her eyes wide with absolute terror, completely unable to utter a coherent word. "I am the only verified, legal owner of this Highland Park estate," I continued, biting every syllable with precise clarity. "You are currently trespassing on my private property. I am giving you exactly 30 minutes to go upstairs, pack one suitcase with your personal clothing, and walk out of my front door forever. You cannot touch the expensive art. You cannot take the designer jewelry you bought with my company's funds. You can only take the most basic personal necessities, and then you will disappear completely from my house and my life, forever." "But where am I supposed to go?" she wailed, breaking down completely as the reality of the grand luxury she had stolen finally shattered around her. "I have no money. All the credit cards are frozen." I looked at her without a shred of genuine sympathy. "Your 30 minutes starts now." Tiffany didn't waste a single second arguing. She whirled around in her high heels, nearly tripping on the hem of her designer gown as she sprinted toward the massive, broad staircase. Her panicked, messy footsteps echoed loudly through the empty marble foyer. I watched her climb the carpeted steps with frenzied, desperate energy, her hands gripping the mahogany banister so hard her knuckles turned completely white. She was no longer the confident, arrogant woman who had walked through this house with her head held high, treating every brick as her own. She had become a terrified intruder fleeing a burning building. I turned my attention back to the mahogany stage. Detectives Miller and Hayes had efficiently secured Bradley, gripping his elbows and guiding him toward the open, massive front door. My son didn't look back at me. He kept his head hung extremely low, his chin nearly resting on his chest, completely crushed by the sudden, brutal weight of the crimes he had committed. As they escorted him through the grand entrance and into the biting winter air, the blinding red and blue flashing lights of the police cars waiting outside spilled into the dark foyer. The bright strobe effect painted the towering walls in alternating colors of absolute emergency, a harsh visual reminder of the permanent legal consequences he had recklessly invited upon himself. I watched the experienced detectives slowly escort him down the broad stone steps, guiding him directly toward a group of serious investigators from the Financial Crimes Unit, who were waiting with extreme patience beside an unmarked car. They were ready to subject him to an intense interrogation regarding massive federal bank fraud and the illegal forgery of corporate documents. Mitchell walked quietly to my right, his heavy leather briefcase now securely closed and locked. He stood with me in the absolute silence of the grand ballroom, watching the final remnants of that fake gala slowly melt away and vanish completely. Vince Carter appeared seamlessly from the dim service corridor, confirming that the hired catering staff had completely vacated the site, and all exterior service doors were now securely locked from the inside. This beautiful house finally belonged entirely to us once more. The suffocating, highly artificial energy of the event had dissipated entirely, leaving a cold, empty, yet extremely serene shell. It felt like walking alone through a massive museum long after it had closed, surrounded by expensive historical artifacts, but with absolutely no living warmth within them. The tense minutes ticked by with agonizing, heavy slowness. I stood perfectly still at the bottom of the grand staircase, waiting calmly for the final, essential element of this long cleansing process to conclude formally. Exactly 28 minutes after I issued my unchangeable legal ultimatum, the heavy, distinct rolling sound of a pull-handle suitcase struck loudly at the top of the wooden landing upstairs. Tiffany finally appeared at the very top of the stairs. She was struggling intensely, attempting to handle 3 massive, extremely heavy designer suitcases at once. She had clearly stripped off the elegant, shimmering gown and hurriedly changed into a pair of tight, dark athletic leggings and a simple beige cashmere sweater. Her once meticulously styled blonde hair was completely messy, and her delicate evening makeup was ruined by her uncontrolled panic sobbing. She practically dragged the heavy, luxury suitcases down the long, carpeted stairs, the small plastic wheels striking every single step with violent, loud impacts. She reached the smooth marble floor of the main foyer, utterly exhausted, gasping for breath. She didn't bother to look in my direction. She simply grabbed the metal handles pulled out from those massive suitcases and began straining to pull them toward the open front door. She exerted immense physical effort, providing a sharp, incredibly pathetic contrast to the kind of highly luxurious, unearned life she had arrogantly expected to secure permanently through deep fraud and massive lies. I followed behind her at a very slow, extremely deliberate pace. My steady footsteps on the smooth stone floor were silent. Mitchell and Vince followed smoothly behind me, forming an impenetrable, completely silent barrier of security to ensure she left my estate immediately and thoroughly. We stepped out into the extremely biting night air. The bitter winter wind whipped violently across the long circular driveway, piercing deeply through the thin fabric of my well-tailored charcoal gray suit jacket. Down the quiet street, the brightly flashing lights of numerous police cruisers continued to dance silently in the dark winter trees. Bradley was currently leaning back against the cold metal hood of an unmarked patrol car, surrounded by several stern investigators. His tousled head still hung low in a state of absolute, total defeat. Tiffany struggled intensely to drag her massive and extremely heavy suitcases across the rough, decorative pavers of the winding driveway. The small, fragile plastic wheels kept getting stuck in the rough, uneven stone surface, forcing her to tug the luggage forward violently and desperately, accompanied by loud, deeply frustrated grunts of anger. She finally reached the absolute edge of the boundary of this vast property. She was just a few feet away from the towering, extremely heavy forged iron security gate, the gate that marked the official, protected entrance to this private residential estate. She stopped right there. She suddenly let go of the metal suitcase handles entirely. She turned around slowly to face me. Her chest heaved violently. In her deep eyes burned a desperate, highly toxic, vicious glow, a mixture of deep personal shame and a lingering, thoroughly malicious, and extremely absurd sense of entitlement. She stared straight at me. Her tear-streaked face twisted horribly into a deeply painful, extremely vicious sneer. "You are a completely heartless, extremely ruthless monster, Richard," she spat out viciously. Her trembling voice vibrated with raw, unfiltered, absolutely pure malice. "You are deliberately, maliciously destroying your own family. You are joyfully destroying your own flesh and blood, just to cruelly prove a point. You could have solved this financial mess quietly, but you deliberately chose to publicly, brutally humiliate us instead. You have thoroughly destroyed your family." I stopped exactly 3 feet away from her. My rigid posture relaxed completely, and my cold expression held no remnants of emotion. I looked steadily at the desperate woman who had once excitedly, eagerly plotted to lock me away in a high-security medical facility, all so she could ruthlessly steal my life savings. I felt absolutely nothing for her. The deep well that had once been filled with profound, extremely painful fatherly grief was completely, permanently dry. What remained was only the bedrock of rock-solid, unyielding, and absolute legal clarity. "You voluntarily signed off on my family 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon, Tiffany," I replied. My low voice sounded as cold and extremely hard as the icy winter pavement beneath our leather shoes. "When you stood in my private study and watched my son gleefully sign a severely fraudulent document that legally erased my physical existence, you thoroughly destroyed any family bond we ever had. You eagerly made your permanent choice. And I am just closing the financial accounts." I turned my back on her entirely, with no intention of waiting for her answer. I raised my right hand and made a sharp, decisive gesture. The gate locked. The heavy iron gate slammed shut with a final, loud, metallic asterisk clang that resonated in the crisp winter air. It was the absolute sound of ultimate decision, a physical boundary drawn between my past and my future. I stood alone in the center of the long circular driveway for a while, watching the police cruisers carry my son away to face his undeniable reality, the blinding blue and red flashing lights slowly disappearing into the dark distance. The vast, extremely expensive estate behind me finally became completely quiet. The chaotic noise generated by that fake gala, the desperate, pathetic pleas of a ruined son, and the vicious, extremely absurd insults of an evicted daughter-in-law had all vanished completely. For years, that deep, endless financial hemorrhage that had been slowly and systematically draining my spirit, and my company's operating accounts was finally, permanently, and surgically stopped. I took a deep breath of the cold, purifying night wind, feeling a profound, incredible weight lift completely off my tired shoulders. The toxic source of infection had been thoroughly excised. I did not continue living in that Highland Park mansion. The very next morning, I instructed my legal team to list the massive property for sale immediately. This grand estate was originally a beautiful monument to the incredible life Beverly and I had built together, but recently it had been twisted into a dark, empty theater overflowing with malicious fraud. I wanted absolutely nothing more to do with the physical space where my own flesh and blood had so eagerly plotted to institutionally deprive me of my right to exist. Instead, I quietly purchased a beautiful, understated luxury apartment in a highly secure, modern high-rise building. It overlooks the vibrant skyline of downtown Dallas. It is only a fraction of the size of my previous residence, but it possesses something infinitely precious. It offers absolute, indestructible peace. There are no terrifying memories echoing in giant hallways, no picky guests demanding lavish hospitality, and absolutely no manipulative family members waiting here to ambush me with endless, artificial crises. 3 weeks later, the bright, clear light of Christmas morning spilled softly across the polished hardwood floors of this quiet new sanctuary. The city below me was completely still, resting in the quiet serenity of a beloved winter holiday morning. In the past, this particular day was always a massive, chaotic production. Beverly used to meticulously plan elaborate family gatherings, filling the house with endless warmth, decadent food, and beautiful music. After her tragic passing, I foolishly tried to maintain that complex tradition, overcompensating for her absence by drowning Bradley and Tiffany in increasingly expensive, ridiculous luxury gifts. I had completely confused true, fatherly love with blind, endless consumerism. But this morning was entirely different. I sat completely alone in the comfortable leather armchair by the massive floor-to-ceiling window. The apartment was perfectly quiet. My steady hands held a simple ceramic mug filled with steaming black coffee. This dark roast tasted incredibly pure, completely untainted by the heavy, suffocating anxiety that had ruined my holidays in the past. I was alone, But for the first time in a very long decade, I did not feel lonely at all. At exactly 10:00 a.m., a soft, respectful knock came at my front door. I set my coffee mug on the glass table and walked over to answer it. Mitchell Harper stood in the carpeted hallway wearing a well-tailored charcoal coat, holding his familiar heavy leather briefcase tightly against his side. He offered a warm, genuine smile that reached his intelligent eyes, a stark contrast to the stern, unyielding legal figure he had been when he relentlessly deployed his strategy on the night of the gala. He stepped inside, shaking off the lingering winter chill, and we walked together toward the small, elegant mahogany dining table near the modern kitchen. He didn't offer any empty holiday pleasantries, nor did he make any meaningless small talk. He knew exactly why we were meeting on this day, this highly symbolic, special day. We were here to permanently establish the final, unalterable chapter of my personal financial legacy. He placed the briefcase on the polished wood table and expertly unlatched the brass locks. Mitchell fluidly pulled out a thick stack of freshly printed, legally binding documents, sliding the first comprehensive packet across the table to me. "This is the final structure for the ironclad trust, Richard," he stated, his voice professional but filled with deep personal respect. "As you explicitly requested, the sole exclusive beneficiary is your newborn grandson. I personally ensured the legal terminology is absolutely airtight. The funds are completely locked, managed by an independent, highly aggressive corporate board of trustees located out of state. Bradley and Tiffany are permanently and explicitly prohibited from accessing a single cent of this money under any circumstances. They cannot use it as leverage. They cannot use it as collateral for loans. Nor can they petition the courts to release funds for their personal living expenses. The trust will independently pay for the child's premium health care, his private education, and his basic living needs, but the principal balance will absolutely not unlock until he reaches the age of 30. Wealth without discipline breeds a toxic cycle, and that ends today." I picked up my favorite pen and signed my name on the designated line with steady, unwavering confidence. I felt a deep, profoundly meaningful sense of true parental responsibility return to my heart. I was finally protecting this innocent child from the massive, destructive arrogance of his own parents. Mitchell then pulled out a second, much larger stack of legal paperwork. "And this," my trusted attorney continued, pushing the heavy pages toward me, "is the founding charter for the Beverly Stanford Memorial Foundation. The vast majority of your corporate wealth, including the proceeds from the soon-to-be-completed sale of the Highland Park estate, will be poured directly into this specific entity. The operating instructions are designed exactly as you specified. The foundation will provide comprehensive financial support, top-tier legal aid, and secure housing to help vulnerable elderly individuals who have been abandoned, exploited, or maliciously manipulated by their own family members. We have been officially fully funded and are ready to begin charitable operations immediately." I reviewed the beautiful charter, seeing Beverly's name printed prominently on the crisp white paper. She had always believed in responsibility and in protecting those who were truly vulnerable. She had warned me about what kind of monster our son would become if I continued to shield him from the consequences of his own poor choices. I failed to listen back then, but now I was finally honoring her legacy. I pressed the pen tip to the paper and signed the final documents, legally transforming my empire into a tool for the public good. I set the pen gently on the smooth mahogany table and leaned back in my chair. A deep, profoundly satisfying warmth spread completely through my chest. I looked out the massive window at the brilliant, clear, deep blue Christmas sky, and finally allowed a sincere, unburdened smile to grace my face. I have lost a son forever in the dark, relentless abyss of pure greed, But in the absolute quiet of this beautiful morning, I am incredibly certain of one thing. I have successfully redeemed my own soul. Sometimes, the deepest betrayals come from the very people you spent a lifetime trying to protect. We pour sweat, blood, and tears into building a foundation for our children, hoping they will respect that sacrifice. But wealth without discipline only breeds toxic entitlement. True love is never about writing blank checks or cushioning every fall. It is about holding them accountable. Even with your own flesh and blood, cutting off a toxic family member doesn't make you a failure as a parent. It makes you a survivor. Protect your peace, guard your legacy, and never let anyone turn you into a victim. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button to support the channel. Have you ever had to cut off a toxic family member to protect your peace? Please share your experience in the comments section below. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next story.